All right. Well, thank you so much, Eric, for taking the time to sit down and talk with me today. Really excited to talk about growing perennial mulches and plant propagation and learning more about Black Creek Farm and Nursery. Um, First, I just want to say, like, what's up with all like the super dope nurseries in New York State? It just seems like I don't know if I'm just biased or if it's just the people in New York State seem to have more of like a media presence, but just like you have like yourself, Akiva Silver, Sean from Edible Acres, like I'm sure a whole bunch more people. Like I'm on the West Coast in Washington.
Mhm.
Is it like what do you have any idea like what that is? It just like the environment or what's attributing to that?
I think that most of it has to do with that kind of the founder effect. Like, um, I think Etta Blakers, Sean is a best friend of mine, and we go back a long way. And he started his nursery a few years before mine. He and Akiva started their nurseries about at the same time, and I think because of mostly both of their social media presence, but also more deeply than that, the accessibility of what they're trying to offer. A lot of people saw that model and said, wow, I can do that. I don't need, capital. I don't need huge amounts of land and tractors and buildings and whatever. Some plastic crates and some wild harvested nuts, and maybe I'm in business. So I think, yeah, I think it has a lot to do with that. And then, that reach has very much extended. I see a lot of nurseries popping up now. And I think it's going to change. It is changing a lot. I think it's going to continue changing a lot as a lot of nurseries start. It's kind of like, um, back in I don't know when, I guess the 70s and 80s, but then there was another wave of small organic veggie farms, right? Like there was probably some like Elliott Coleman in Maine and other states had their own version of that. And you get one person really doing it. The food system had gone to this huge industrial thing, and then some people decided to make some small local veggie farms. And then a lot of people did that. And now here in New York, we're so far beyond that all of those markets are totally saturated. You can hardly start a veggie farm, a couple acre small market garden style thing. That kind of thing used to be accessible to small growers who want to get into farming, and now it's hardly accessible anymore because it's so saturated. So I think that's another factor that people are looking for. How can I get into a land-based livelihood and make it make sense economically? There aren't that many options. This is one that has certainly become an option.
Do you feel like that's kind of the trajectory of these types of nurseries like yourself and Twisted Tree Farm and Sean with Edible Acres, like that whole niche per se? Do you feel like that may be the trajectory of that type of niche?
Yeah, I think the trajectory, at least for myself, I can speak for Sean a little bit because we talk all the time, um, is that I would be very happy for more people to do this kind of work, and we will just change. Everybody has to find a niche, right? It's about niche analysis. You need to not necessarily come in and do the same thing that everyone else is doing, but find something a little bit different. Like I've already noticed certain nursery crops that we grew for several years and were really a staple for us. Now nobody wants them anymore, and I think that's because there's a lot of small nurseries that are like this that have come into being, and that's great. Um, and so every year I'm trying to figure out, okay, what else can I grow? Because the reality is there is no shortage of people who want to buy plants. I mean, I don't even know what the numbers are, but the plants market, 99% of all the plants purchased are at Home Depot and Lowe's, and among the edible fruit trees, it's like Starks Brothers makes I don't know how many millions of dollars. So, people want to buy the plants. People are aware that small nurseries that have a lot of integrity and a lot of care in how they grow things may have a valuable product in that we don't use the chemicals and the fertilizers and the new plastic and all that stuff. And I think a lot of people care about that. And not a lot of people knew necessarily that most fruit trees, nut trees, berry bushes are produced with a huge carbon footprint, chemical footprint, everything footprint. The nursery industry is allowed to use chemicals that not even the food producers are allowed to use because they're way more toxic. So there's a huge amount of learning and sharing of knowledge for people who want to buy plants that needs to happen, so that the market for the small nurseries that are growing in a really thoughtful way um, can reach those people, so that they know why it might be a better idea to buy from a nursery like one of mine, or other people who are starting nurseries like this kind of model.
Sure. What were some of the examples of those types of plants that you were growing that seemed to kind of drop off in being oversaturated and less demand?
Yeah, for chestnuts and a lot of the nut
I thought
species.
maybe that.
I
Yeah.
love growing chestnuts. I still do. I figured out, the air prune box is something that, Sean and Akiva and myself and many people have made videos about, and it's the easiest thing to assemble, and everybody should do it. I really think anybody who has a garden, you should also just make a little air prune box so you can start your own um in a 1 foot by 1 foot square box. You can start enough trees that, in 5 years you'll be loaded with fruit. It's amazing. And then I guess you don't need them everywhere. They're really about preventing rodents and animals from getting the seeds, which is a big issue. But that is so accessible to do, that I think enough people have done that with chestnuts, that um, enough chestnuts were produced and sold, and I think that market, or whatever you want to call it, has very much been filled.
Yeah, yeah, and I think especially in your neck of the woods in New York State, um, we have chestnuts here, just around, but from what I observed, nothing in the quantities that you. It's very rare for you to just drive down the street and happen upon chestnuts. Or we do have native oaks here.
Yeah,
Shagbark hickory is like you're not going to find that unless somebody planted it, most likely.
yeah. Yeah,
So
red chestnuts are actually super rare here. We used to have, of course, the American chestnut, and those are basically, uh, well, not what they used to be. They're almost, almost don't find them except for some sprouts. But even planted chestnuts, in my county, I know about several dozen. But it took me a long time to find those. And you drive around in June when they're flowering and nothing else is flowering, and then you see the chestnuts. Um, but they're not a very common thing here either. And I think that not everybody wants to plant a chestnut either, because they get to be this huge tree. It's kind of intimidating for a lot of people. Most people want to
yeah,
plant like a tomato plant and maybe a raspberry bush, and if they're really into gardening, maybe like an apple tree or a peach tree or something, like accessible, people that people know about.
right. You got to be a kind of pretty big plant nerd
Yeah.
sometimes. Um,
But
so
then the
for
native landscaping has also become a really big thing in New York. I'm sure it's the same in California. So that's a whole other niche that is
right,
available.
right. For the listeners, can you give us just a brief introduction to yourself and to Black Creek Farm and Nursery? I spent quite a bit of time looking through your YouTube channel and Instagram, and there's this whole other side, it seems, from my perspective, to Black Creek Farm. Like the farm side is like, are you doing produce? Just give us an overview of what all you got going on in your operation,
Yeah,
and
it's
maybe like how you got started.
sure. Yeah. I My farming journey really started when I took a trip to Mexico before I went to grad school, and I spent a summer in an indigenous village, just randomly, not on any kind of program. I just met them at a farmer's market and went, and I got to learn about the milpa system of farming from the Zapotec people, and it was amazing. And it completely changed, my trajectory. And I think that's probably the one of the biggest influences made me be interested in like local food systems, perennializing food systems, to see it there in real life where the community lived in a perennial food system was unbelievable. And coming back to America and seeing like all the street trees and all of our communities with manicured lawns and nothing edible and just, chemicals and whatever, everything maintained with chemicals. It was so shocking and bizarre that the system that we've created. And then, yeah, wanting to be part of that, the what I think is the antidote to that or whatever. So, um, yeah, and then I guess, um, I went to grad school for natural resource management, so I was going to focus on that. But then I really didn't want to work in an office or I didn't really want to. Yeah, natural resource management didn't feel that right to me either because there doesn't need to be this crazy dichotomy between how we manage land and how we get food, and that's this path of like active land management that produces food that is based on perennial systems. And if you start thinking that kind of stuff, it doesn't take long until you find permaculture. And so I came back from grad school and took a permaculture course, and then ended up working with Ben Falk at Whole Systems Design for a while. And I've been teaching permaculture courses with him at his spot for about 10 years now. So been involved in the permaculture movement. And about 10 years ago, we bought this place, and it's 35 acres, and it has some very unique soils. And we we created at first the idea was, we planted a lot of fruit trees, and we planted some agroforestry systems right off the bat. And then um, we ended up trying to, well, we did have a organic farmers market model where we ended up getting up to about 15 acres of vegetables that we sold mostly at farmers markets and some wholesale accounts. And to be honest, in the past couple of years, we've been downsizing all of that because we now have 2 kids. It's really busy. The nursery has been working out pretty well, and trying to rebalance the you know amount of free time, the amount of time that we have, the amount of people that I'm trying to work with. So yeah, we're trying to switch veggies over to less intense no-till systems, do less of them, and focus more on the nursery. And yeah, the nursery was born initially out of the idea of, I plant these agroforestry systems, and I want the whole place that's under my stewardship to be full of all these super useful plants to become a living landscape. And to do that, you can't buy all those plants. So had to start,
Right.
I had to figure out how to grow them, and grafting and propagating. And it took enough of my time and effort that I was like, at a certain point, you're like, okay, well, this is obviously a more lucrative thing to do than veggies and stuff like that in a lot of ways. Unless you're really dialed in with the veggies, there's some very good lucrative veggie operations, but for many folks, you end up with vegetables just working really a lot and having low wages come out of it, which it's tough because I love growing food. That's the main thing for me is, I want to really have a model that produces like real meaningful staple crops, not just lettuces and all that kind of thing. I want to be part of a movement that I feel like could actually feed the area. Um, so that's why we ended up with the nursery that focuses on the food plants that we do focus on.
Yeah, and so for the nursery, what would you say your obviously you have the online shop where you sell plants. Is
Hmm.
that your primary means of getting plants out there, or are you also putting a lot of energy into local farmers markets and doing local plant sales as well?
So we started out doing only local plant sales. And then I started shipping maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it was a real learning curve to learn how to ship effectively.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That is an intense part of the business that, it's like that. I find most people who get into farming in this generation, although this may be changing, but most people aren't first and foremost marketers or business people or interested in all that kind of stuff and accounting and bookkeeping. I mean, most farmers don't get into farming for the bookkeeping. Um, and so many of us, myself definitely included, do all that stuff pretty reluctantly and pretty poorly for a while until you realize, like, this is a really critical part of the whole. And if I don't do this well, I'm not going to be able to do the fun stuff that I love. So anyway, it took me a while to really figure it out, and I have not really figured it out. In fact, I just got the other day, Sean, I was at his place. He gave me this tape dispenser for packing tape. That's
Yeah.
you get like the crafts tape.
Game changer,
And
huh?
like I was like, what?
Where's
Like,
this been my whole life? Yeah.
it took my boxing time down by like a third, which
That's
is
so funny.
it's just ludicrous, and
Yeah.
I've just been using both hands when I could use one hand. And any business, and that part is the same for any business. You have to do those things efficiently, especially because we don't really hire a lot of people. Sometimes we just do like informal work trades. For the veggie farm, I had some full-time people. For the nursery, it's mostly just me, which is part of what I love about it. Um, you get to have a lot of informal work trades with people. And yeah, so anyway, like learning how to be more efficient has taken a very long time with that kind of thing. But so that allowed me to finally have shipping be the main part of the business, and that was great. And then it's funny you asked that now, because literally yesterday I got the thumbs up from a local farmers market that I've been hoping to get into for a while, and we're going to go there and sell plants. And we've done farmers markets before, and I think that this one in this town will probably do better because of a number of reasons. But I don't love potting plants, but there's this whole thing with the bare root nursery model that, especially, okay, let's say you're selling primarily edible plants and you're selling primarily bare root. It's the best for the plants. There's no doubt about it. They grow the best, they're the happiest. But from a business perspective, you're not growing any of the plants that 90% of plant purchasers want, right? So you're like, what are you doing on that
Do
front? I
you
don't
have
grow ornamentals.
strawberries?
Yeah.
Or
I get calls every year. Hey, do you have Thuya, Green Giant? Do you have hibiscus? Do you have roses? All of these things. I started growing rugosa rose because it's edible. Um,
okay.
but like there are so many ornamental plants that like I don't know why I don't grow some, just for purely economic reasons, even to just subsidize some stuff like biomass willow and whatever, people want that. But so you're not going to grow most of the plants that most people want to buy, and you're not going to have plants when most people want to buy plants, because at least here, May 27th is our last frost date or whatever, and people start getting those like warm days in late spring, and then they want a garden, and then you don't have anything because you only have bare root plants and they're already leafing out and they had to be planted 3 weeks ago. So it's this really ridiculous thing where you're kind of like, shooting yourself in the foot because of some kind of like, this is the way I want to do things. But anyway, so this year, I was able to get a huge amount of secondhand pots from like a local soil and water conservation district. They do their big plantings. They had 2,000 pots. They were gonna, just chuck them or whatever. So I got them for free. So I'm like, I have the pots. We get some compost. I'll put the plants in the pots and get another crack at selling them. So yeah, so it's if you can find a good farmers market, it can be really good.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, pretty much summed it up there. I mean, you have like some of the shortest, pretty much the shortest selling window, and like the most
Yeah.
of the nichest of niche, like
Yeah.
selling formats, bare root plants. And yeah, I mean, the people who are into it know. And but if you're trying to expand your base and make a living, then you gotta do some adapting.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, I've been trying to think through growing plants that I'm still excited about, but that have that larger uh yeah, are a little bit more intriguing to the average gardener. Like a lot of the berry plants, everybody knows and loves berry bushes. They're a very simple thing. They don't take up a lot of space. They're accessible to most people. And then stuff that's like could be ornamental but is also useful. There's a lot of plants that meet both of those. Like the whole crab apple, there's plenty of ornamental stone fruit. There's plenty of medicinal plants that also are beautiful and have flowers. And then there's the natives and that kind of thing. So I think, for me, trying to find a lot of those that people will be interested in, from an ornamental perspective, but that I still feel good about growing and that I would like to plant here. There's a lot of potential in that category.
Absolutely. Shifting gears to the main topic I wanted to get into today, perennial mulches. Why would someone dedicate growing space to producing their own mulch? For the listeners, if you only had a small yard, what would you say to someone to convince them that may be a good idea, or maybe it is situational? Is growing your own mulch material only for people with large yards, or why do you grow your own perennial mulches? What do you even mean? What I mean by perennial mulch?
Yeah. So, the idea of mulching is really to counteract our kind of knee-jerk tendency of tillage, right? And everybody knows who's a lot of gardeners and anybody who gets into agriculture starts to learn about tillage and what it does to the soil and how detrimental it is. And so, okay, we don't want to destroy the soil structure, we don't want to oxidize carbon, we don't want to destroy the habitat of all the soil microbiome, we don't want to bring up all these kind of weed seeds. So it's pretty easy to realize that mulching is preferable to heavy tilling and hand weeding forever. And then many people will immediately jump to plastic mulch, which is just bad. I don't know how to sugarcoat this. It's garbage. uh I used it for a while. I was like, uh everyone around everyone around uses it, everyone says it's safe, everyone says it's okay. You kind of like get caught up in whatever is normal. And then one year I was really doing a lot of research about it, and it's not very safe, and there's a lot of stuff leaching into the soil. There are a lot of phthalates that get into the soil that are taken up by crops that are even in the edible portion of vegetables. And I actually did a whole presentation about this. I have a whole, I wrote a scientific white paper, cited. You can go on Google Scholar and find this stuff. There's just a lot of pretty worrying phthalates that get released from hot black plastic in contact with the soil. So you got that. You also have the fact that it basically just creates a terrible dead zone under the soil. It's not really building, well, it's definitely not building soil. It just is stopping weeds. So anyway, most people don't want to till. They go to plastic. Plastic has a lot of drawbacks. Next step is mulching. So you want to use organic mulches. And this is where most permaculture people are at, is I'm convinced about the mulch. Where do I get the mulch? People go and buy straw, they get waste hay, they find leaves, whatever they can. And over the years of cardboard, I did all of those things. And every time I researched more, I found another bad thing, another bad thing. Oh, there was a compost facility in the Intervale compost facility in Vermont that had to they were testing their compost, and they realized that it was full of benzene because the leaves get driven by while they're piled up by the side of the road, and the car fumes contain enough benzene that it bioaccumulates in the leaves and doesn't break down in the composting process. So you're bringing
Tire
carcinogens
dust
in.
too, I'm sure.
Yeah. And yeah, so everything, that and we live in a world where there's toxins everywhere. You can't be perfect, but you don't want to necessarily be just like importing lots of stuff onto your farm. And then the hay. The hay is the worst one. The Nordell's farm in Maine, uh, they started this organic farm. 10 years later, they got the idea to test for PFAS, the forever chemicals, PFOS, PFAS, and they were hundreds of times higher than they should have been. And it was because it was old dairy land. At least in New York, most of all the dairy land that produces all the hay was treated with humanure, milorganite, and human biosolids they call. And all of that stuff has massive amounts of heavy metals, massive amounts of PFAS. And so that stuff just never breaks down, and you buy it in the mulch and you put it on your garden and you're growing your food. So that's no good. So then what does that leave? There's nothing left at the end of the day. Basically, there's no mulch that really feels super good and safe other than maybe arborist wood chips. And that's, there's a limited supply. So anyway, that's my whole backstory as to how I got where I got with the perennial mulches. So I have been researching, can I grow my own mulch? How am I going to do it? Practicing. And that was actually what led me to find the work of Ernst Götsch, and Syntropy. And, for those of you who don't know, syntropic agriculture, agroforestry, was invented by this guy who's just really a hero of mine.
What
And
was that name again?
Ernst, Ernst, Götsch, Gotsch. And he is, much of what I do is inspired by him and his work. And the idea is pretty simple in a sense, is that instead of planting just fruit trees, you plant all of succession. You plant ecological succession. You plant an entire forest. Your fruit trees are there, but the early successional species are there and the late successional species are there, and it creates a real ecosystem that builds its own fertility. And I was just in love with that idea. How can you turn that into a profitable thing? Well, he did that. He figured all those problems out. But he's in Brazil, and not much of his information has reached America. It's in Europe a little bit, but anyway, so I started thinking, okay, we can certainly plan so that we have enough mulch to service our trees, the things that we want to grow. And so I started working with some C4 grasses and some basically anything that grows super fast and accumulates a lot of biomass. You can plant it.
Can I
Yep.
interrupt you there? So you just said a key kind of vocab word there, C4 grasses.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I had not heard of C4 grasses
Hmm.
prior to reviewing your YouTube channel. Can you explain what exactly a C4 grass is? What makes it a C4 grass?
Yeah. So essentially, there's two methods of doing photosynthesis. Plants use the C3 pathway or the C4 pathway. And the C4 pathway is essentially, it just allows them to be way more productive. And what you notice with C4 plants and C4 grasses is that they're usually in the warm season category. So everybody knows about cold season and warm season grasses. And many of the warm season grasses, but not all of them, use the C4 pathway. So it's a more efficient form of photosynthesis. It's much more common closer to the equator. So plants in the tropics and subtropics, a larger proportion of them use the C4 pathway. But to put it in perspective, orchard grass, which is one of the most productive C3 bunch grasses, it's a cool season temperate grass. That grass can put on, if things are going pretty well, up to 8 tons an acre of biomass, usually 6 to 8 tons an acre of biomass. Miscanthus grass, which is a C4 grass that can grow in the temperate area, and I have it growing here quite well. It can put on 19 to 25 tons of biomass. So it's just huge, so much more biomass. Switchgrass is a native one. It's a C4 grass, and it's also a nitrogen fixer. You can hardly believe how good that grass is. And so everybody says grasses are that fruit tree's enemy. You have to kill all the grasses. But if you have a bunch grass that moves and grows in a clump and then doesn't have stolons, that's very easy to manage. And if you measure for miscanthus, the clumps get to about 4 feet in diameter and then pretty much stop if you mow them once a year. They won't move from that for decades. So you can plant a row or a clump of that grass 6 feet off of your fruit tree and have an endless source of more than enough mulch than you could use for that fruit tree. And basically, designing your planting to include enough biomass plants not only gives you the mulch, but it does all kind of wonderful things under the soil. So that photosynthesis that the C4 plants are doing, up to 70% of the energy or the photosynthates are exuded through the roots to feed the microbiome. So you don't just want to maximize the growing conditions for your crop trees. You want to maximize the total photosynthesis, all the growing in the soil that you have. And so including the biomass plants, including the fast growing mulch plants, you're getting so much more than mulch because it's not just the dead part of the plant that decomposes that feeds the soil. It's actually even more so the exudates of the living plant that are feeding the soil, and a healthy soil that has plenty of carbon being pumped into it can afford to give the fruit trees, the high demanding trees, all the things that they need. An impoverished soil that only gets a meal every once in a while via dead plants from somewhere else, imported mulch, doesn't necessarily have the budget to give the fruit trees everything they need. Because the fruit trees and the nut trees and all the crops that we're growing, they're not just out there picking things up in the soil. They have relationships with the organisms that are in the soil. They give them things, and then the soil gives them things back. The the mycorrhizal fungi, um, many other soil, endophytes, ectophytes, and they have these relationships. And if the soil isn't humming with life, it doesn't necessarily have enough to give the fruit trees everything they need. And so, yeah, that's the main point, is that you get the mulch to prevent the weeds, but you also get so many other benefits from a living mulch. And you just have to figure out which ones are fast growing but also easy to manage, because there are plenty of fast growing plants like Phragmites, produces an astounding amount of mulch, but I wouldn't want to plant that in my plantings because it goes everywhere. It's too hard to control. It goes into the row, and then you have a lot more work to do.
Right, and that's a good point there. As far as management of these C4 grasses, what they would look like potentially uh in a system where they are, I guess they could be, you plant them in their own kind of area perhaps and chop them and move them, or what seems like what you're suggesting and what I've seen from what you do is you're planting these types of grasses adjacent to rows so that they're
Hmm.
right there, and you also do a lot of work with like scything them and hand managing these types of plants.
Yeah.
um is that what you're doing?
Yeah. So it appears from it looks very chaotic, or it can look chaotic. It could also look much more orderly. Um, and the main idea is really that I think out of all the permaculture people that I know, the amount of time that everybody spends mulching pathways is astonishing. And a lot of gardeners do that, right? You have to walk somewhere. Access is really important in your garden, but it's a constant need. If you don't mulch the access ways enough, then you get undesirable growth in the walkways. So the idea really is use the access ways to grow your high biomass producing plants, and walk, just don't worry about walking so much until it's time to manage those grasses. Of course, you can time it. You can, after a year or two, you'll get the idea of, okay, I've planted switchgrass. It's a warm season grass. And so the first time that I'm going to cut it isn't going to be sometime in May. It's probably going to be sometime in late June. But you can manage the grass in the alleyway where you're not going to walk there until it's ready to scythe it or to sickle bar mow it, or you could use a regular riding mower or whatever you have. And then so in one move, you're doing your access management, you're generating your biomass, and all of that stuff is adding to the life and the quality of the soil. Whereas if you import your biomass, your mulch to mulch your pathways, you're having to get biomass from somewhere else that now lacks biomass. So it's been impoverished. It had to get to you. You had to take work to move it and to deploy it. And then it's only so much time until the next round when you have to do that again and re-up. And then people get sick of it and then they put landscape fabric over it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that just makes so much sense. I don't know why everyone wouldn't just do that. So, you
So
know?
there are
Yeah.
a few hard things about it for temperate growing. Um, if you put all this huge amount, I mean, but this isn't unique to growing your own mulch. This is, if the timing is such that you put a huge amount of mulch next to your fruit tree in the fall, sometimes that can result in vole habitat and all that kind of thing.
That's a big
So
consideration for sure.
yeah, you can I've definitely lost some trees that way, although I think I have figured out why they are there in certain spots, and I'm addressing it. But the idea of it is a revolutionary thing. It was for me to think that instead of I have to manage access just to get somewhere, now I look at a small garden. I'm looking over here because this is one of the places where I kind of learned. Um, I planted these trees, and I always just cut the grass, just like anybody does. You just cut the grass and let it drop on the alleyways. And now I can't wait until the grass grows enough that I can scythe it and get more material.
Mhm.
And it takes a little while, but some of the areas that I planted have kind of flipped over now to the point where the grass is growing really well and it's providing enough mulch for what I need. Now the trees are getting big enough that they're casting a lot of shade, and the soil really starts to change then, you know. So it's so much more than just growing the mulch. You get so many benefits out of it, and you save so much time and effort. You never have to move. The idea is you never should have to move mulch more than 2 or 3 feet to the left. It's all there, and you put it over to the side. And then a lot of the time too, if you are cutting grass fresh and laying it down, um, when you do that, you don't have it doesn't oxidize. It doesn't lose a bunch of its nitrogen in the drying process. So you put it down and you stack it, and you have all this wet grass, and that leaches all of the nutrients through into the soil around your tree row. And so you're just getting more out of the same amount of grass that way when it's not dried out.
Yeah, yeah. That's awesome. I totally understand. And I mean, I'm totally guilty of, yeah, I just countless truckloads of leaves from the local elementary school and driving the truck to the mulch pile, filling
Yeah.
the truck with mulch, driving it back to the house, unloading it into a pile, moving that pile to where it needs to go in
Yeah.
like whatever perennial systems, like
I mean,
backbreaking
don't
work.
say
Like,
guilty. That's still a great thing. I don't mean to
well, yeah,
say that's bad. And we still
no,
get
no,
mulch because the nursery can't use, some of these systems can't work on certain parts of the nursery. I just need to bring in mulch. But having this idea is it can free you from a lot of that work. That's the benefit of it.
Yeah, for sure. Talking about some of the species that you work with closely to do this, you've mentioned miscanthus grass, and I have a very, very small patch that I established last year, and I'm excited to see how much it grows this year. I still
Mm-hmm.
don't think I'll be able to really harvest any substantial amount. But then you've also talked about Sudan grass, and then
Mm-hmm.
also switchgrass. So would you be
Yeah.
able to give an overview of those? Are those the three main species that you work with? And can you give an
Um.
overview of them?
Yeah. So, well, it's not. Yeah. The grasses are what I think of using annual and perennial grasses in the establishment and first several young years of a new planting. So the idea being like, let's say, um, let's say you have rows of trees that you're going to plant. Um, Whatever space you have between those rows, that area could be managed with producing biomass. And there's all kinds of ways to design this. If you leave a little bit more space, then you might be able to do a center row where you have vegetables or something like that.
Alley cropping
Depending,
systems.
yeah, exactly. Depending on how productive the grass is. But if you're starting with like a tilled field, then I'm using something simple like maybe perennial rye and oats. They get the first amount of biomass. Then you can cut a 12-foot swath and bring it into a narrow band. And then you've got a nice mulch band that you can plant something into, and then seed Sudex grass again. And then you get a huge amount. Then you put that in, and then you can seed your perennial grasses. Um, or with switchgrass and miscanthus, I plant propagules, vegetative roots. So you're kind of just like opening a trench and planting these roots in, and they'll eventually, over a couple of years, outcompete pretty much whatever else is growing there. So, but it doesn't have to be any. It doesn't necessarily have to be those three species, although they do perform incredibly well over a wide range of America and beyond. But the main criteria for me are super fast, whatever you find around that grows, twice as much as any other grass and is bunching. Um, that's the main thing. Like I've seen there are some people who just have a huge amount of quack grass or reed canary grass, and these are stoloniferous grasses that grow everywhere. They're very
Mhm.
hard to manage, but if that's what you have, you can work with that. It's just there will be a lot more management in and around your fruit trees. So if you're going to be planting it, I would go with only bunch grasses. I haven't used any bamboo for this. I'll say that. That seems a little
Mhm.
bit impossible to manage. I have some bamboo plants, but I wouldn't use them in this way, I think. But so yeah, the grasses are yeah, the Sudex grass is an annual. So at least where I am, it's an annual. And so we basically will seed that in a context where the soil was worked the previous year, like if we grew vegetables or something like that. So we see that as a cover crop. And it's also like I wouldn't say it's a good nurse crop for the perennial grasses because I think it slows their establishment down. But if you plant them in and then they grow and then you cut it in the fall and then you plant in your perennial roots, that's perfect because that way the roots will be able to overwinter, the Sudan grass dies, and then the next spring the perennial grasses can come up. So that's a good way to transition over. Um,
Yeah, that makes
and
sense.
then you can also include other species in there, like in terms of legumes, nitrogen fixing stuff. The only reason that I try not to make those too complex is that I think you really want to time it so that you have the best amount of growth. Grasses all have the logarithmic growth curve. They grow slow, then they grow really fast, and then they start to have a seed head and they slow down the growth. So right at that maximum growth, right after that maximum growth, before they start going to seed, that's when you want to cut. You get the most biomass that way, and you leave it in the best position to regrow another, uh, to have another spurt of growth. So that way you get the most biomass and it's the healthiest for the grass. If you're out there cutting it every time it gets 4 inches tall, you're going to exhaust it, and it's not going to do well the next year. So yeah, um, yeah, the switchgrass and the miscanthus are the ones that I've worked the most with, and they're easy to propagate. They take a little time, but once they get going, you'll develop a lot of propagules really quick that you can transplant pretty easily. Um, and of course, that's really the tip of the iceberg for perennial mulches. There's also all the woody species and the perennial herbaceous species that provide, a lot of permaculture people are huge fans of comfrey, and that's well deserved. It's a great plant that
Yeah,
puts out tons
comfrey.
of mulch. Yep.
I grow a lot of that.
Yeah. And that's a great border plant. You can have that on the side of the rows of trees so that nothing can, no stoloniferous grasses can invade or whatever. And that's something, another great plant that you cut it, you put it on top of the soil, and it just nutrients leach out of it into the root zone. So they call the comfrey a dynamic accumulator, and these grasses that I'm mentioning, they have roots that are twice, 3 times as deep as the grasses, as the comfrey. So they're doing that accumulation as well. And all of those plants, generally, if a plant grows super fast and vigorously, it's feeding the soil really well, because it can only do that if it's getting a lot of love from all the mycorrhizae and the rest of the soil biome. So wherever you are, look at the plants that are growing the best and that are easy to manage, and plant those next to your fruit trees in high density. It makes it more management. There's no doubt about that. You can't just plant these super vigorous, fast growing plants next to your fruit trees and then walk away and not manage them. So that is one caveat, is that if you're going to listen to anything I said, you have to be there and manage it a lot.
Right, and that would be one thing that I would imagine would concern some people as far as the grasses, as far
Yeah.
as them spreading from seed, perhaps, and that's part of, you have to be there to manage it. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
miscanthus or Sudan grass or any of those are relatively. I don't know if they're considered seed sterile or if they would spread from seed, but in your management
Right. Yeah.
strategy, you're
So
not going to get to that point.
yeah, and that is one big consideration for which species you select. So Sudex grass is not seed viable here, only because we don't have a long enough growing season for the seed to mature. It's a very long. It's a African plant, so it doesn't mature the seeds in the amount of time, at least here. But it might in California, so that might be, you definitely would want to prevent it from getting there. But then Miscanthus giganteus is a seed sterile hybrid, so that does not spread from seed.
Good to
Switchgrass
know.
can spread from seed, but it's really bad at it. It really prefers to creep in little bunches, and so I've literally never had a seedling pop up that I noticed. I think it's just a non-issue. Perennial grass seeds they're pretty slow to establish usually, so they're not as big of a concern. But yeah, if you were going to use Miscanthus chinensis, that is a seed viable species, and that could definitely, is something you want to consider for sure.
Yeah. Okay. So for listeners, if you're thinking about getting miscanthus grass, you just don't just go pick up any kind of miscanthus. Make sure you're doing, make sure it's a seed sterile one. And I think that's the one I have, is the giant miscanthus grass.
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's actually, speaking about nursery stuff, that's another crossover for me. Is when I started the nursery, the last thing on my mind was maybe I should propagate ornamental grasses. Now I'm like, wow, I love growing these grasses because I use them, and I think they have enormous potential to make
Yeah.
orchards healthier.
I was stoked to get
But
them last year.
yeah, and there's like, I'm not necessarily into like the candy striped grasses and all that stuff, but there are dozens of species yet to explore for me. And I'm definitely gonna Actually, Sean gave me another variety. It's like a half Z miscanthus. It's like it only gets 6 feet tall, and the stems don't become like bamboo strength. So that might be another one that's good for other contexts. But fast growing, bunching, seed sterile. Um, that's a good recipe.
All right. And in looking over your videos on YouTube, I wanted to shift gears here and talk about plant propagation. If you're into plant propagation already, you are most likely familiar with setting up a bottom heat system for winter propagation, where you have a heating mat on the bottom, usually sand, some sort of medium, and you're rooting plants in the winter that way. Then also in the summer, there's an option for having an intermittent misting system.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, one thing that really caught my that maybe I kind of do a double take that you were talking about is rooting different types of like palm fruits and stone fruits in your winter bottom heat system.
Mm-hmm.
Up until now, like the general consensus, at least that I heard, is just pretty much bottom line that you just can't root fruitwood cuttings like that. But
Yeah.
what you're suggesting, what you've seen some success. So I was hoping you could kind of share a little bit of your experience with that, because that's a potential game changer and really goes against the grain.
Yeah. I think the main reason that it's not a common practice is, yeah, sometimes it doesn't work that well. So there are some real drawbacks, but the real main reason that it's not a thing is the rootstock situation, is that most nurseries that grow fruit want to have it on a specific rootstock, um, for whatever reason. Like commercial producers of fruit need to have a known rootstock that's going to allow the tree only to get to a certain height or confer cold hardiness or be good for wet soils or whatever. Rootstock thing it's a whole thing. But for most home growers, it's not as important. But like take apples for example. Apple cuttings actually work pretty darn well, fairly reliably. The main reason that people don't do it is because you get a standard root system for the most part, meaning a seedling apple usually will grow to a tree that can get 30-40 feet tall. And if you want to keep it shorter than that, you're going to be doing a ton of pruning and you'll have a lot of work to do. So people would prefer, if I graft trees, I do it on M111 or Bud 118, and then you get a tree that's a little bit more manageable. Um, but for stone fruit, for example, um, Siberian sea peach, which is a white peach, from the white peach group, which is originated in northern China, they're a little bit hardier and a little bit, now they're hardier, and I think they're a little bit, I don't know what to say. The Persian, the yellow peaches and white peaches came from involved in two different regions. And I only grow the white peaches because the yellow peaches around here are a little bit more disease prone, but they root really well from cuttings. You can do winter cuttings, and like I tested even white peaches, you can cut them and stick them right in the ground and you can get 25%. I mean, outside when you're pruning in the winter. You stick them right in the ground, maybe now ish, late February, early March, two nodes above the ground, four below, and you might get a quarter success. If you put them on heat, I get probably 75% rooting on those.
Wow.
So yeah, so they work fairly well. The tree it grows a little bit differently for the first year, and then after that you can hardly tell. So that definitely works. Pear is actually quite interested in rooting. I realized that I could do that when I had some scion wood. I took the scion wood, forgot about it, and put it in. I think I had like left a package of scion wood in a cup of water and like under a bench somewhere. And I came back like a few weeks later, and it was all, calloused, and one of them had a little root sticking out, and I was like, really? So then again, I just took those, threw them in the rooting chamber, and some years it works really well, other years not so much. I'm not sure how there's variation like that. There's black currants and elderberries are very reliable all the time, and the fruit wood is a little bit more finicky. That's for sure. But there's this book called The Woody Plant Propagation Manual by Michael Durr, really classic, and it goes through each plant. And I believe in there they recommend apples. The best success is semi-softwood in June, so relatively early, before a lot of lignification happens. And they're talking about 80% success in that. So each
Wow.
plant has its own special window. Um, and I don't really use rooting hormone. I tried for a few years, and I don't really like it. I read some stuff about it that it's like kind of actually. I was pretty taken aback. This one guy who's a nursery grower that I know, who's like uses all the chemicals. He's like, "Ooh, don't get rooting hormone on your hands. Like, don't touch that stuff." I was like, I've seen that dude mixing like a diesel tank with this, bare
Yeah.
hand. It's
It's like,
like,
okay,
you are
well,
worried about rooting hormone?
sure.
Okay. Um, so yeah, something to be cautious with. But if you are open to using rooting hormone, and you have the Woody Plant Propagation Manual, you basically know exactly when to try almost anything. Um, and yeah, so the hardwood cuttings, though, in very general sense, way more plants are open to doing summer growth cuttings than hardwood cuttings. Whatever, you start with hardwood cuttings because it's way easier to do. You keep the air cold, you keep the roots warm, the roots wake up, and then you can transplant it, even if it's going to still be frosty outside, which is awesome. Um, and creating the summer rooting chamber can be as simple as just making a chamber, covering it with white plastic, putting it on the north side of your house, and misting it, and then putting
Right.
cuttings in sand.
It
It can
doesn't
be
have to be
that
this
easy.
big elaborate system.
Yeah, exactly. I guess, what was his name? Mike's Backyard Nursery. Just such an awesome YouTube channel. I don't know if he's still kicking it, but he just, he's like a total ornamental grower. He's not really on the same page in that way, but he grows like hydrangeas and forsythia and whatever. But he's the same. He's on the same page in the sense that he started a backyard nursery in his backyard and just really knows how to grow a lot of plants in a small area. So a lot of his techniques I've used and adapted, and he has a lot of videos on how to do the super simple cutting propagation, the summer cutting propagation beds. I chose a little bit bigger one in the greenhouse with the intermittent misting system. Definitely took a lot of time and a lot of PVC work, which I hate, but I did it, to make that misting system, and that it really opens the gate to being able to propagate so many more things, like the sea berry, the gumi, goji, all kinds
Yeah.
of the figs. A lot of the berry plants that don't do well, like I tried gumi hardwood cuttings many times. I never got a
They're
single one to take.
difficult.
They didn't
Yeah.
work. And in the summer cuttings, I get 100%. I mean, virtually 100% gumi, which is
Mhm.
cultivar gumi. That's like gold for me.
Right. And talking about the misting system and the plants that you're having success with in there, what would you say would be what would be like the top three fastest to root in that misting system? And also in particular, I wanted to hear a little bit about your experience. You've done mulberry cuttings in there, I'm assuming. Is that
Yeah.
correct? I wanted to
Mhm.
hear how they do in the misting system as well.
100%. I was so psyched. Last year I did a whole bunch of Illinois everbearing. We have two here that are seedlings, but that are amazing. And mulberry is a dioecious plant, and so you don't want to. I'm a little bummed about selling people dioecious plants. I just basically say on the website, I'm like, this is a seedling of a dioecious plant. I wish you the best. It could be a male. You should probably buy three for $10 or whatever. Um, and so yeah, but they root as easily as figs. You take the general rule of thumb. If you're not going to get the manual, which is fine, is a plant, woody plants, the bud breaks, the shoot elongates, and when the shoot, again, like the grass, the shoot elongation starts slow, goes fast, and then begins to slow down, and then sets a terminal bud. And that terminal bud is the last growth that it does. Somewhere after the solstice, somewhere after the solstice, when the lignification is far enough that you bend the shoot with your hand, with your fingers, and if it gives some resistance, it's starting to lignify. And you got to get a feel for how much resistance means enough lignification. But basically, after a good amount of lignification, that's the best time for most plants. True softwood cuttings are just when the shoot is super soft, there's no lignification. That's kind of tricky because if you mess up the misting, whether it's too wet or too dry, you'll either rot it or dry it out and it dies. Once they lignify, they have a little more wiggle room, but many, many, many plants will root at that time. Plants that would never root from hardwood will root at that time. So a lot of the berry bushes, I only begin to take cuttings in July or August, or for some species, even September is the best time. And then you have to deal with the fact that the plant roots, and then it's going to be winter. And so what I normally do is root them, dig them out, bag them, put them in the cooler, and then plant those out the next spring. So that's a kind of convoluted, but it works.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I feel like we covered a lot in this conversation, and it's crazy that an hour just kind of blew past like that. I feel like there's
it really did.
Endless hours of we just scratched the surface, I'm sure. But as we're wrapping up here, just want to say thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me and sharing so much awesome information. For the listeners, can you share where people can find you in socials, and how can people connect with you after the show if they were interested? And where can they get plants from you?
Yeah, we do have an Instagram. It's called BCF Nursery, or at BCF Nursery. Our website is bcfnursery.com, and my email and contact information is on there. So definitely the best way.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Erik. I hope to have another conversation with you in the future. Hope you have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. You too. Good luck.
All right. Thanks so much, man.
Have a good season.
All right. Later.